So the U.S. and Iran are in the middle of a month-long military engagement. This is one of those things I would really prefer just to ignore for the most part. Uh, I did not predict this. I suspected this was not the way things were going to go, but here we are. Now, one of the reasons I really don't like talking about this is because I don't know really what's going on. Now, the big similarity between pretty much me and almost every pundit on X and YouTube is they don't know what's going on either, but they like to pretend they do. Um, Essentially, virtually all the information we get via the media, what gets leaked out there, is really an attempt to shape the narrative. So, and obviously, people are trying to shape it from two different directions. So, if you're out on X, you can literally watch one post saying the United States is essentially getting its talks handed to it, and the other one where essentially uh, we've done everything to Iran but cause it to glow and irritate, and the truth lies way in between. So just to give you like a taste of it. So one of the things that's going on in conjunction with this is there's bombing going on in southern Lebanon by Israel. And so we see a building in the residential area exploding. Did it really happen today? Well, previous war, you'll see that where they'll show you footage of something and it's like, oh, well, this it happened today. So we don't have a whole lot of context. We know for a fact that Israel did it. There's a lot of interfighting between various groups, uh, and not every munition falls where it's supposed to. Could have been an accident. The locals may have had misfires. This happens all the time. Israel may have not intended that as a target. Munitions, even though they're much better than they ever been, they don't always hit where they're supposed to. Were they operating on bad intelligence? Did they think something else was there that they were dropping a bomb on? Was Hezbollah? Did they have equipment? Did they have members? Did they have leadership on that site? A distinct possibility. The main thing to understand here is both sides, Israel, uh, to a certain extent, the Lebanese, Hezbollah in this situation, all have a massive motive to lie about what happened. So you're going to have a tendency to lean in the direction that you've already made up your mind what happened. So if you don't like Israel, you say, oh, they blew up civilians on purpose. And if you're an Israel bot, you're going to be going, well, of course, every last square inch of that building was covered in Hezbollah. So it's coming up with the truth is very difficult. And the same thing comes up with what's actually going on in Iran as well. Both sides have a motive not to tell you the absolute truth. They're trying to shape a narrative. Another thing is nobody really knows what's going on in negotiations. For the most part, diplomacy happens behind the scenes and in back channels. What you see on the news, so someone says, oh, I saw this on the news and certain person said X. They're trying to shape the narrative as well. The information they're giving is primarily for an audience that is not the diplomats. Now, to a certain extent, sometimes it can be shaping the diplomats as well. But it's like walking into a car dealership and saying, okay, well, uh, I've got $20,000. What can you sell me? Well, you're going to buy something for $20,000 then, or more if you're actually incompetent. You don't show your hand. And everyone assumes that whatever they hear uh, a government official saying something, that they're loaded up with sodium pentothal and have to tell you the truth. You don't know what they're saying. You don't know why they're saying it. You don't know if it's the absolute truth or if it's something they're trying to get you to believe or somebody else to believe in order to further the narrative that they're working on. And another thing that's really sucks about this war is a lot of my fellow libertarians and people I have really, really deep respect for absolutely lose their goddamn minds on stuff. Um, it's their absolute red line. And it's not mine. So, I mean, I don't want war to happen. I wish it didn't. It'd be nice if it never happened again, but that's not a realistic way of looking at things. And there's other things going on in the world. There's big picture events outside geopolitics, the national politics. There are big things at stake. And quite frankly, I'm not willing to throw everything overboard or Iranians getting killed. It's sad. I wish, but I've met, when I was over in Turkey, I met a lot of Iranian expatriates. Like the people, they seemed decent. I wish this wasn't happening, but I'm not going to throw everything away for them. Sorry, I am America first. A lot of libertarians are essentially doing what I would call the equivalent of crapping their pants in public and not even realizing it. Really major figures saying things like they're rooting for Iran. And I'm not talking like little piddly people you've never heard of. I'm talking like mainline libertarians saying stuff like this. People, especially hoping this doesn't work out somehow, just having temper tantrums. It's really sickening, and I understand it. It's their big thing. It's their big thing, and and I get that when my lines get crossed, yeah, then I get upset too. But I wish I wish they had, because they don't function like real human beings. A real human being realizes that just because it's your issue doesn't mean it's everybody's issue, and it doesn't give you the right to be a jackass and insult people. That's I'll just get off that because that's yeah. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the background to understand what's going on. So the Shah of Iran was installed by the United States and British action, I believe, late 50s. And I worked with people who were stationed in Iran, American servicemen. Essentially, a lot of them ended up coming over to Turkey, where I was working in the 80s, and a lot of them were saying it was very comparable to what was going on in Turkey at the time, where essentially in this picture here is most likely showing Iranian women in the 70s. Um, and in Turkey, as what these people I worked with reported in Iran, essentially the big cities were very much comparable to Eastern European cities. I mean, you go there, it wasn't like the most forward Western city in the world, but it was definitely had a Western vibe to it. And then the fun thing is each 10 miles you went outside the city limits, it was kind of like going out, 50 years back into the past. The further you went away from the city, the closer you got to 800 AD. So while the Shah liberalized, essentially doing things that a lot of people in the West recognize as being good, he also had a lot of problems he had to deal with. There were anti monarchy Republicans who wanted him gone no matter what. They were willing to revolt. They didn't want to. Um, they didn't want to reform their way to republic. They wanted to get rid of the monarch, and then they had to deal with theocratic regressionists, basically hardline Islamists who wanted a society that looked a lot more like Wahhabist Saudi Arabia, just in a Shia mold. Then they also had hard socialist people who leaned heavily on Marx and wanted to see that kind of society and were willing to do it violently. And alt note, true Marxist communists who wanted revolution. They were also dealing with the problems of the Soviets undermining them, basically trying to destabilize and cause problems for them because they were on their front line. and Iran was our first line of defense into the Middle East. And they also had a problem of dealing with Arabic undermining, where uh, Arab, okay, Arabs and Persians are different people. They speak a different language. They have a different history. They have a partially shared religion that ended up splitting in a schism. So essentially, a lot of the Arab Sunnis also worked to kind of undermine the Shah of Iran. So, in order to implement these liberal policies, required him to act in a very authoritarian manner. Uh, so, on one hand, on the surface, everything looked good, but all these dissidents who were basically rabbling around the background trying to mess things up were dealt with in incredibly brutal ways. Interestingly enough, Israel trained Iran's secret police. And their secret police were very well known for going over the top, torturing, uh, extrajudicial killings, etc. For a while, well, during the Shah's reign, Iran actually covertly cooperated with Israel because it was the only other major entity in the area that was non-Arab, and to put it into perspective. So, on one hand, the Shah is this liberalizer, on the other hand, he's an authoritarian. It's easy; you can do both at once. So, before the Shah goes away, while he's in place, if we look at Israel, Israel is really hated because it's a nationalist entity. It flies in the face of what the globalists wanted. However, it had to be tolerated because it was the only non Soviet uh, country that was in the Middle East. Essentially, the Soviets had penetrated in some manner or other into all the other Middle Eastern countries. So they were tolerated as a platform for intelligence and a way to launch operations into the region. Now, Iran essentially was just looked at as Europe's gas station and the front line against the USSR. One thing to remember, for the most part, the United States has really actually gotten very little of its fuel from the Middle East. They've set up their system primarily to deal with American heavy sour crude, Venezuelan heavy sour crude, with essentially the Middle East just being a backup. Europe has been the major beneficiary of our Middle Eastern policy, and that was by design. The globalist system was you give up your decision making in terms of security and foreign relations, and we'll keep the sea lanes open and the fuel will flow. Well, things changed with the Carter Doctrine. And if you know anything about the rabbit here, side joke, look up Carter and killer rabbits. Anyways, uh, essentially, when Carter comes into place, we're just coming out of Vietnam War. Um, there's a handful of countries basically either becoming communist or swinging that way. So it really looks like the United States is losing the third world to the Soviets. So Carter's administration decides they're going to counter it by championing human rights and not supporting dictators, thinking that we will make better inroads and points with the people of the third world, and thus we will be better able to influence them. Now, leading up to this, Iran had been moderately destabilized due to some of the other factors I mentioned, but also the Shah had made a few bad economic decisions. He was modernizing his military too quickly and really didn't have the funds to do it. So Iran was in a not collapsing mode, but basically they kind of moved themselves uh, into a dangerous position. A country that's stable, no big deal. You get over your economic hiccup and you're done. But if there's some instability there, you have a problem. So that put the United States into a position of deciding to either prop Iran up or tip it over. Well, the Carter administration decided to tip it over. They figured, well, we'll just bring in somebody, we'll get rid of this authoritarian, and we'll bring in somebody who's more of a populist of sorts, and this will fix everything in the third world. It'll make people happy, and they'll look at the United States saying, "Hey, we care about the people. It's not just about anti-communism." So the Ayatollah was seen as a staunch anti-communist and anti-Sunni who would be willing to work with the US in their own best interest in order to keep the Soviets out and keep Sunni Arabs from crashing through their borders. Unfortunately, what was unforeseen is that the Ayatollah Khomeini hated the West and Israel just as equally as he did communists and Sunnis. So this put us into a position where uh, Iran was taken out of play in terms of uh, how they functioned for the United States. Now, to a certain extent, they remained a frontline bulwark against the Soviets because they did not like the communists. Uh, Essentially, their view was they were atheists, and being a theocracy, atheists are actually worse than rival believers. What shortly follows after the Ayatollah taking over is we have the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq initiated it thinking that Iran was in a tough spot and they would be able to be a big pushover. And very quickly they discovered they were losing. The United States ended up selling Iraq lots of weapons and giving them intel to at least keep them from falling to the Iranians and stop the theocratic revolution from spreading. However, interestingly, at the same time during that period, we also sold Iran arms in order to keep our foot in the door. Um, Iran was a country that nobody was willing to believe that we'd lost them from our orbit, that they were off doing their own thing. So we get into essentially what's the post-Soviet neoliberal era. The neoliberal era beginning obviously with the end of World War II. So what happens when the Soviet Union falls? Well, then our views on Israel were allowed to move from our contempt for them as being a nationalist state, but they're no longer critical to us with the Soviets gone. So Israel is now viewed as a huge problem. They're nationalists, they're occupying unrecognized territory. And so essentially, the two state solution was implemented as a way of destabilizing Israel so that it would not be a major player in the Middle East. The bizarre thing, and we've had a lot of strange things that occur during this period where Iran is repeatedly courted by the West. And ultimately, at some point, Iran rebuffs them. And in fact, Iran has humiliated our diplomats on numerous occasions. Like one example being, when we gave them pallets of money, and then they basically showed it on, here's footage of the pallets of money they gave us. And there are many other things like that as well. And trying to figure out why we were so desperate to get Iran back into our orbit while at the same time willing to put up with all kinds of stuff. I believe that the Iran was eventually kind of viewed as the China of the Middle East by the globalists, whereas all kinds of horrific things are tolerated by China via the globalists because they're hoping that someday they're going to integrate into the world economy and be our best buds. Think they desperately were thinking, well, Iran's like a mini China that'll eventually come around to our way of thinking. If we look at the first Gulf War, essentially we see a lot of the old Soviet aligned Arab states are brought into our coalition, like Syria, for example. And during that war, Israel was completely locked out. We refused to give them uh, the friendly identification codes that would allow their planes to fly through our airspace without danger of getting shot down. So the idea was we kept Israel completely out of it in order to foster a new coalition of Middle Eastern Arab countries. And this was partially a sign of the neoliberal order's absolute disgust with Israel. Um, and it was a way of trying to keep the Iranian proxies in line with Western interests because proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, um, the Houthis, etc. Now, when the second Gulf War rolls around, uh, we essentially see a rise of our neocons. And essentially, neocons and neoliberals are actually very similar to each other. Neoliberals prefer negotiation over bombing, neocons prefer bombing over negotiation, but their end goal is the same result. They want a globalist system uh, with a semi-Americanized government at the local level. Now, the interesting thing is both sides, whenever they try to topple a country or influence it, they want to put in a parliamentary system. You ever notice that they've never ever gone into a country, pushed over the leadership, and then tried to install the American system with a strong leader, uh, indirect elections, Congress not electing the president? No, they always go to the parliamentary system because parliamentary systems are fragmented, especially the more uh, subgroups you have in the country, the more likely they're not going to be able to get anything done via that government. Now, the goal of neocons was they thought, oh, well, we'll put in an Iraqi democracy, parliamentary government. And essentially, this would be both a base for us to work from and also would trigger a democracy domino effect that would spread out through the whole Middle East. That's not what happened. So we see what was known, or it wasn't known, I'm calling it the Obama pivot. And the Obama pivot was pretty much, we'll just leave Iraq shattered. You know, if paramilitary groups are operating at will there, if basically a warlord state with uh, broken up into fragments all over the place, we're okay with that. We'll occupy our areas, we'll have our bases, we'll operate out of it. We'll be quiet about it. We won't interfere a whole lot with Iraq unless they actually go after our bases. And that's pretty much the way it's been. The other thing with Obama is he continued the idea of courting Iran. And again, I believe it's this China of the Middle East syndrome. And their goal was to create an Iran that had no viable enemies, thus continuing to destabilize Israel as a potential threat, uh, not allowing any of the Arab states to rise as a potential threat, uh, leaving Iraq a mess, keeping Israel's in the two-state solution mode to keep them occupied and not dealing with things. So it seems like their goal was to allow Iran to essentially continue being the dominant feature of the Middle East, allow them to come very close to having nuclear weapons, believing that at some point that would lead to a stable situation to where they would start coming back into the globalist orbit. Then Trump shows up, and Trump basically tips this whole table over and goes in a different direction, going with the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, again, you read them because you, if your information is from mainstream media, you don't actually know what was going on. It overtly abandons the two-state solution in order to stabilize Israel so that Israel doesn't have to worry about interior problems. It creates a Sunni Arab Israel alliance economic zone to further secure Israel. Idea being is Gulf states would have the money, Israel would have the know-how and some of the manpower, and then the other Arab states would have the manpower if needed. And eventually, uh, one of the reasons why Israel doesn't have a significant defense industry of its own is the United States told them not to. They told you'd be wasting your effort, and plus, with the as tiny as Israel is, it'd be really easy to target their defense infrastructure and take stuff out like that. Whereas if they had an alliance that was spread across the Middle East and into North Africa, you could actually have defense industry that was spread out in a way that allowed native defense industry to spring up that wasn't entirely dependent on the United States. Ultimately, the Abraham Accords are designed to be a stabilized Middle East that the US can start to disengage from, includes Israel. And then Biden gets elected, so we essentially have the Biden whipsaw. And the biggest thing they did was they pretended that didn't really happen. They ignored the Abraham Accords. They didn't try to advance it any further. And it just sat there doing nothing. A couple of the countries kind of moved forward, but it was very tepid because no one really was getting leadership at that point. Then when Trump comes back into place, we get Middle East Trump version 2. And the Abraham Accords are accelerated, pressure is put back on Iran, and then Hamas ends up attacking Israel. And this attack did more, uh, essentially, it was done but with Iran's hand. They eventually acknowledged that they did know it was happening and did encourage it. And one of the reasons why Iran encourages in the first place is they were trying to stop the final signatories to the Abraham Accords, primarily the Saudi Arabia. Uh, However, this attack completely freaked out the Sunni Arab governments and pretty much got them in line to say, when we are in a perfectly politically stable mode, the Abraham Accords go through. We can't live in a Middle East where Iran can do things like this. If they can do that to Israel, they can do it to us too. And we're not as stable as Israel is. The Hamas attacks were the absolute death of the two-state solution. People who think Gaza and the West Bank somehow are going to end up turning into some little sub-state or a new nation, it's not going to happen. At very best, there'll be autonomous regions within Israel. But yeah, the Hamas attacks ended the two-state solution. Countries, except for some of the populations, do not back this at all anymore. Now, one of the key things that Iran was led to believe for the longest time, because everyone would say, oh, well, look, they've built their nuclear program inside these bunkers. Uh, there's nothing we can do about it. No one can stop them from building a nuclear bomb. And Iran started believing their own, they're not their own propaganda, but that Western propaganda. And they believed their nuclear program was invincible, that was untouchable. So therefore, it was not a point of real negotiation. I believe Operation Midnight Hammer, that quick bombing raid that happened last year with the bunker busters, deep penetrators. Uh, I really don't believe that the goal was to stop their nuclear program. It was probably spread out enough that trying to do that was probably impractical. I believe Midnight Hammer was done primarily for negotiating purposes. It allowed or basically forced Iran to realize that just because you buried it deep doesn't mean we can't get at it. So, therefore, since we can get at your program, you probably should negotiate. So, I believe Midnight Hammer's sole purpose was to bring Iran to the negotiating table. Uh, so, that's why I think a lot of people got confused. It was like, oh, well, they said their nuclear program's been destroyed. Now it's back again. I don't think First, I don't think Iran's ever been 2 weeks away from building a bomb. I think they've been several months away. And I think they probably stopped it as a way of trying to find a middle ground with the West where they could say, hey, we want to be able to deploy a nuclear weapon rapidly, but we will not make the final step. And this was acceptable to the globalists, not acceptable to Trump. So yeah, I don't believe that Midnight Hammer was designed to take out their nuclear program. So I think their nuclear program was in pretty much in the exact state it was, and this is something the Trump administration understood. It's just that you can't sit there and say, well, the reason we bombed them was to get them to negotiate. People don't listen to that. So you have to say, well, yeah, they were close to building a bomb and we stopped them. So, uh, so this brings up what I'm calling the North Korean conundrum. And this is something that came up in a interview with Rubio that did not really get well spread, and it's pretty telling in a way, assuming it's accurate. I mean, obviously it could be just bluster, but if it's accurate, it gives a lot in the way of the thinking process of why this all just happened or that's occurring. So, according to Rubio, he was saying that when North Korea was on the verge of a nuclear bomb, they were basically we knew they were getting ready to test, that the Clinton administration seriously considered strikes on North Korea basically to disrupt their bomb building process. And the reason they decided to stand down and not do it is because if you know anything about how Korea is set up, the demilitarized zone is very close to the capital city of Seoul. It's in artillery range. So if we would have struck nuclear sites in North Korea, the fear was that North Korea would retaliate by basically doing an artillery barrage on Seoul. 10 million people there, the casualties would have been horrendous. So therefore, they decided they were not going to do it. So Rubio was comparing this to what Iran was trying to do. So what happened was in the follow-on to Midnight Hammer, Iran didn't come to the negotiating table. They basically started absolute bonkers mass production of missiles and drones. And so uh, what our intel and State Department communities came to as a conclusion was that Iran was essentially trying to create the North Korea conundrum by having so many missiles and drones that they had the ability to strike all over the Middle East and hit every single population center in such a way that no one would ever want to go after their nuclear program. So, if this is the case, and it sounds plausible to me, this war was actually to essentially knock down their missile and drone capabilities in order to basically take away a shield for them building their nuclear program. Another oddity, and I don't know if I believe it seems plausible, so I'm on the knife's edge of whether I believe or disbelieve this. When the final talks were going on, one of the big issues was nuclear material. The United States was basically saying, turn over your weapons grade material. And what we'll do is we will give you a civilian grade material. And if you want to do reactors, we'll help make sure that you're getting the material in order to run nuclear reactors, but we're not going to let you have a bomb. And at some point, the Iranians made a comment in the negotiations about that they had the capability or enough nuclear material to build, I think, something like 11 bombs. Now, the U.S. negotiating team said, well, to us that says they're threatening to build bombs, and they're not understanding what our red line is. Now later, I think it was Cutter would come in and say, well, no, that's what they said, but they were actually, it was just a statement of fact saying this is how much we got. More of a declaration than a threat. So the question comes down to was, was the advertised threat that the United States took away from negotiations the reason the war started, or was it really the missiles and drones? And I'm leaning a lot towards the missiles and drones. I'm behind. So there's a lot of BS on this war, and it's painful to listen to it. So one of the big things is the talk of regime change. Now, what exactly is regime change? So some people say, well, what happened in Venezuela was regime change. We took their president, captured him, and then somebody else in the government over. Well, that's not regime change. Regime infers the entire establishment and the political structure involved. For example, Germany and Japan during World War II was regime change. Uh, they weren't allowed to have any remnants of their former government involved in anything, and everything was scratch. Iraq was regime change. We took the Ba'athist Party out and replaced it with chaos. Venezuela wasn't regime change because all government functions just basically were run by the pretty much the same people. And the vice president there, either because of pre negotiations or post negotiations, said, okay, well, we're going to change the way we do things in order to be on friendlier terms with the US because obviously we can't stand against them if they're going to, flex their military at us. So Iran, in the situation it's in, they've been putting together a theocratic state since 1979. So it means that they don't have a alternative establishment to fall back on. So if you remove them, it's going to get replaced with nothing. In fact, it's just going to get replaced with more of them coming in from the sides. So when people say regime change, killing the leader is not regime change. If somebody assassinated our president and the vice president takes over, no one would say that's regime change. If a bomb went off and killed like the first several people in the line of secession, and there's a point where like it flips down to Congress and somebody from the other party can actually end up taking over. Even in that situation, we wouldn't call it a regime change because the Constitution's still in effect, the courts are still in effect, Congress is still pretty much Congress. You just had a change at the top that doesn't affect the general way things are going to operate. And so I don't believe regime change was a primary goal here because you hear they kind of waffle back and forth saying whether this is regime change or not. I don't think that's the goal, and killing the leadership isn't going to cause it. I mean, in theory, it could cause a revolution, but not very likely to cause a revolution that's going to get you the change you want. Okay, one of the things I like to point out, and I see all these people, especially libertarians, like, oh, I saw this in the news, therefore it's absolute truth. I know everything that's going on in the Middle East, and I know everything that's going on in the diplomatic negotiations because somebody on MSM told me. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about when I was over in the Second Gulf War. I was in Qatar. We were providing intel support to the first MEF and uh, the special forces groups operating in the north and the southwest. Southwest, yes. Um, and one of the things is we were giving you basically we were prepping maps, basically turning real time satellite imagery into maps, identifying possible locations of enemy, etc., etc. And the first MEF was basically the main military group pushing forward. And so, you'd go around and there'd be, like in a chow hall, there'd be TVs up with the news networks up telling you what's going on, etc., etc. And I can tell you for an absolute fact that nothing going on the TVs even came close to matching the reality of what was going on the ground. The network would be going, oh, yeah, they're experiencing stiff resistance in this area, and they're like, they've been through that area hours ago, it's gone, and there wasn't stiff resistance, they rolled right through, and then they'd be saying, oh, yeah, and they're stalled out because of this, that, and the other, and they're still rolling along. They would report battles occurring in places where I doubt they even received sniper fire out of. So what you're hearing on the news, what you're hearing even on X, for the most part, is garbage. And there might be some stuff in there that's accurate, but virtually everything you hear has contradictory counterparts. So which one's accurate? Well, you're going to choose the one that most fits your worldview. The other thing, so because we were feeding the information to the first meth, uh, we were pretty much getting very routine updates. I'll say, walking over to the main center every 15 minutes or so just to find out, okay, where are they at? Where do they think they're going today? What are their main targets so that we could give them the information they wanted? And a lot of times, even with that, we were missing giving them information. Basically, they'd already moved over the area that we were prepping information for because they were moving faster than what even command structure realized they were doing. So if I can sit in an intel center a couple hundred of miles away from the action and not entirely know what's going on, and I can see media literally is just making crap up as they go along. My experience tells me that everything I'm hearing is untrustworthy. I can't trust a single thing I hear. But people who've been, armchair quarterbacks for their lives, they know exactly what's going on. So, main thing is if you're making decisions based off what you're seeing on X, rethink it. You have to get out of the small picture tactical view of things and start looking at where things are going. And this goes on with this goes to diplomacy as well, not just the war. We don't know how it's going. We don't know. They're telling us what's happening, but they're more concerned with shaping the narrative than they are getting us accurate information. If accurate information uh, tells the proper narrative, then you're hearing accurate information. If it doesn't, they will change it to meet the narrative. Most open air diplomacy is aimed at the home country population. So if you hear it on the news, it's not for the diplomats, it's for the populations. Another thing I try to point out, so if you really want to understand 90% of what Trump does, you really need to at least look at a synopsis of the art of the deal. Okay. And I'll point this out to people and they'll go, oh, he thinks Trump is doing 4D chess. It's like, no, you're a tard. Part of the deal is not like, it doesn't mean you're omniscient and every single move you're making uh, is brilliance. It means you're asking for 10 times more than you want. You don't tell them what you're what you're willing to take, and you try to get the most out of it. So if you're trying to listen to what Trump is saying and go, well, gee, I know exactly what's going on. Well, in terms of the art of the deal, part of what he's saying out in the open is he wants to shape the narrative. So when he asks for something very maximalist or makes a very high end threat, uh, the goal is to get people to move. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the intention. So one of the things you can really tell is a lot of these people out there, my fellow libertarians included, is when Trump says something that matches their worldview, well, he's telling the truth. It's like he's on truth serum and he's incapable of telling a lie. However, when it conflicts with their worldview, then all of a sudden he's lying. Well, it can't be both. So pick up this pattern, and when you see it, you'll go, "Oh, yeah, this isn't true. You don't know what you're talking about." You know, and I'm not going to say I understand what he's doing. I don't know. I don't know anymore what Trump's acceptable take from this is any more than anybody else. That's my key point. I'm not saying I know something. I'm saying nobody knows anything. Another stupid thing that came up over the month was claiming that bombing bridges and power plants are war crimes. That's absolute drivel. I'm showing you a picture from World War II. Essentially, anything that's dual use is a legitimate target. We bombed bridges in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, in Yugoslavia. Ukrainians are bombing bridges, and they're heroes for doing it. If a civilian food truck drives over a bridge and goes onto a military base, the bridge is now dual use. The definition is very wide and broad. So these people claiming war crimes literally know nothing. And I find it really ironic that libertarians who are not supposed to be globalists immediately fall back to UN and internationalist garbage. Oh, we'll take them to the Hague. Yeah, great. Now, another thing to understand is that all this airspace sharing was set up in advance. Essentially, you had air defense networks in pretty much all the Sunni Arab countries. Uh, and when the US fleet moved in, suddenly all the air defense networks, US Navy ships, US ground forces in Iraq, in the bases, occupying the bases there, Sunni Arab countries, Israel, their air defense networks suddenly all linked up and started working together. This isn't accidental, it was preset. And the only way they all work together is by permission of everybody. So this tells us that everyone kind of knew this was coming, and all the Arab Sunni countries really want this, despite what they might be saying in the open. In some cases, their lips say no, their air defense systems say yes. The other thing to understand is Israel is being allowed to operate over Arab airspace. They're basically flying through corridors, getting guidance from the ground control to get to their targets. So the Arabs know where the Israelis are flying and where they're targeting. Again, the Arabs want this. In order for Israel to get to a target in Iran, they have to file flight plans to transit U.S. and Arab airspaces. In order to get through their defenses and not get shot down by friendly fire, they have to sit there and say, hey, we have an aircraft that's flying from A to B. So they know where B is, because it's not going to just be like, oh, well, we're flying through your space and we're not going to tell you what we're doing. So the thing is a lot of people have been pulling this, oh, Israel's out there just being a rogue nation. They're bombing things and we don't even know what they're doing. Well, that's probably convenient to be able to use that. But the thing is, every single target Israel hits has been cleared in advance. They are not out picking their own targets. Okay? Can you think how dangerous it would be if the U.S. and Israel were just operating in Iranian airspace and just each hitting each other's targets and not coordinating? That's a good way to get planes shot down. Short thing is somebody's saying, well, Israel's just attacking things we don't know about, they're high. They don't know what they're talking about. Israel is attacking only what they've agreed to via us. We're doing air refueling over Arab airspace. You're telling me that Israel's somehow sneaking in there and bombing things we don't know about. It's not happening. The Strait of Hormuz has closed down in past conflicts. The idea that nobody knew this was going to happen is zero. Everyone knew this was going to happen. The question is what were people hoping the result would be? Interestingly enough, the last thing I just heard, that wasn't confirmed yet, is that Trump will be imposing a full embargo of the strait. Was that his plan all along? I don't know. It's an interesting take, but ultimately, the thing is, remember, the United States doesn't get most of their oil from the Middle East. And now everyone's going to be getting it not from them. They're going to be getting it from us in Venezuela. Okay, and then, getting back into the whole civilian targets getting hit. And that's one of these things where people get completely freaked out about. And a lot of times you have to keep asking the question. Okay, so a school for girls gets hit. Who hit it? You don't know. All sides are going to claim side did the other. Did the ordinance go off target? I mean, was that not the target in the first place? Things don't always hit their target. Was the ordinance intercepted and fell on the wrong target? This happens all the time. A rocket gets shot down, doesn't go to its original target, and then falls on whatever's below it. Did the targeteer have bad intel? Was the building dual use? Was it close to a legitimate target? Was the damage assessment even what they are depicting it to be? A good example was back in the first Iraq War. They were showing Baby Milk Factory, which was supposedly us bombing a civilian plant, and it turns out it was dual use. It was being used by the military as well. Well, so the answer is it's on this girls' school. So what do I think happened? I don't know. I have no clue, and nobody on X does either. They just have their presuppositions, and they're basically working on off those. If they hated the war, they're going to say it was intentional. If they hate Israel, they're going to say Israel did it and it was intentional. If they are bonkers and love this war, they're going to say, yep, it was an accident or it didn't even happen. Now, another theme I see popping up is this idea that either Israel forced us to do this or somehow tricked us into doing this. I don't believe Israel has any secret method of controlling the United States or its politicians. Uh, okay, so like, oh, APAC, look at all the money you put into Congress. Congress doesn't really declare war anymore, and they don't really step in to stop wars. And even if they do stop in to stop wars, uh, at best they can get things stopped in 90 days, and no one's really trying. Is that APEC? I don't think so. For the most part, you have to keep in mind that Israel is dependent on the U.S. for their defense. And we have a horrible system in our country in terms of campaign contributions. It's very easy for foreign aid to be essentially laundered back as campaign contributions. Does Israel do this? Absolutely. Because they're dependent on us, because their actual survival depends on us. They use our system to the fullest against us to buy our politicians. Bar none, Israel is the greatest threat of foreign influence on our government. But the two things can be true at the same time. Yes, this guarantees the defense money keeps flowing to Israel, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have some secret lever that forces us to go to war for them. Another thing coming up is the idea that they lied about the intelligence and somehow we fell for it. It's not very likely something like that would happen. The only place Israel has a really huge boost on us is with human intelligence spies on the grounds because they've got essentially Jewish Persian people infiltrated into Iranian government, and they can get a lot of information we can't. It's very unlikely the United States would go off some piece of Israeli intel without some kind of authentication. So the idea that we were tricked into this doesn't fly. Another thing to remember is Iran is not Iraq. People point this out, but it's not Iran's bigger, it's more mountainous, etc. But at the same time, there's lots of Iran that's uh, pretty much close to uninhabitable. One of the things that's hugely alters comparisons to Iraq and Iran, Iraq was a minority ruled country. Essentially, it had a small Sunni minority who were running a Shiite majority. So upending their government created instability. Uh, Persia, Persians are the dominant majority of Iran. Shiites are the dominant religion. The likelihood that a minority takes over is almost zero. So we're not going to see the same kind of instability come out of Iran. Another thing is Iraq's neighbors benefited from Iraq's instability, and Iraq had neighbors in all directions. Whereas Iran, most people don't want to see it unstable, with maybe the exception of Afghanistan, but that's limited. In fact, for the most part, Iran's neighbors, the adjacent ones, the one that actually border them, fear Iran's instability. So they're not going to feed it because the Iranian Persian majority, Shiite majority, there is no other group that can take over. So there's nobody that somebody else is going to want to feed to hope that they end up in charge. So ultimately, why did this happen? I do believe the missiles as a threat to protect nuclear deployment is the key issue. Bombing of the missiles, missile production, missile launch sites, drone production, drone launch sites. That is the primary objective in this war. I think the secondary objective is furtherance of the Abraham Accords, creating opportunities for the U.S. to disengage. A weakened Iran makes the Israeli-Arab alliance more functional. And one thing to keep in mind is Israel either needs our security or their own security, or they're forced to fall back on nuclear bombs. If we stop giving them conventional weapons, then the only thing they have as their first line threat is the nukes. And we really don't want Israel in a paranoid situation where they think their survival's at stake, thinking, well, the only thing we got is nukes. I guess we got to use them. I think ultimately this is another goal to force Iran back to a decision point. Essentially, when this is all done, they're going to be economically wrecked. So they're going to be forced to either decide to rebuild their military at extreme cost to their economy. So if they choose to do this, they risk more and more instability and unrest. So it may force them to do a rebuild of their economy and take care of their people before they consider going after the military, meaning this is a built in delay. I also believe this was a goal. One of the goals was to destabilize a key Russia ally and put Russia closer to negotiating an end to the Ukraine war. Uh, Russia has been getting drones from Iran. Russia has been getting expertise from Iran. Iran has been helping Russia sell its oil clandestinely on the market. Taking Iran out of the loop puts more pressure on Russia to negotiate with Ukraine. And also, I think this is actually just as big as all the others. This puts China in the vice class. At least 20% of their oil comes from Iran. And they've been getting it at extremely cheap prices because it's essentially embargoed oil. So now China is being forced to pay market rates when they can least afford to do that. And one of their big suppliers is offline. They're going to have to come to the United States and pay whatever price the United States sets on that oil. There's a good likelihood that there are non-public negotiations going on with China, essentially saying, hey, we're demanding concessions from you. basically follow our tariffs, uh, keep the various critical infrastructure stuff like the rare earth minerals flowing, or otherwise we'll keep the strait shut down for a long, long time, and there's no way you can make this up. And ultimately, if Iran could be brought back online as a non-embargoed nation where their oil is market price, this puts a huge drag on China's economy. And I think that is planned. Another goal would be to remove intransigent, can't pronounce the word, leaders who aren't willing to negotiate, in hopes somebody who is willing to negotiate would surface. Again, that's not really regime change if the same theocratic elements are in place, but they come to a different conclusion because of pressure. All right, a lot of information to digest, and be interesting to see how it goes. I hope this ends quickly. I think, again, by the time October rolls around, this is going to be very in the past information. Most people are going to forget it happened. Unless something unforeseen happens, I would see the economy correcting very rapidly uh, once the world is dealing with this situation better. I think this is going to resolve probably within a month. All right. Tell me in the comments below, what do you think's been going on with the war? What did I say that resonates? What did I say that you're like, I don't buy that? Tell me what you think. I'm interested. Smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm's brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please subscribe. Check out my other titles. I get into a lot of things. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.